Most people who kill lavender aren't lazy gardeners. They're actually the opposite. They water it faithfully. They mulch it like every other plant in the yard. They check on it constantly, and they still watch it turn brown and woody within 2 or 3 years. Meanwhile, there are lavender plants growing wild on the side of a dry, rocky hill in the south of France that have been alive for decades, with essentially zero human attention at all. Nobody waters them. Nobody prunes them on a schedule. Nobody worries about them through winter. And yet they keep coming back year after year, thicker and more fragrant every season. That gap between the lavender that dies from too much love and the lavender that thrives on total neglect isn't luck, and it isn't about how much you care. It comes down to 5 specific things almost nobody tells you when they hand you a lavender plant at the garden center. 5 details that completely flip how you're supposed to treat this plant compared to almost everything else growing in your yard. Once you know them, you can genuinely forget about this plant for weeks at a time, and it will reward you for it. Let's go through all 5, one at a time. Secret number 1. Drainage matters more than everything else combined. This is the single biggest killer of lavender, full stop, and it has almost nothing to do with how often you actually water it. Lavender evolved on rocky, sun-baked Mediterranean hillsides, growing directly out of thin, gritty soil where water runs off almost the instant it touches the ground. Take that same plant and drop it into typical garden soil, especially anything clay-heavy, and water pools around the roots even if you think you're barely watering at all. That trapped moisture sitting against the crown and roots causes rot, and that rot, not drought, not neglect, not forgetting to water, is what actually kills the overwhelming majority of lavender plants that die. The fix is simple, but it has to happen at planting time, not later. Plant it on a slope, on a mound, or in a raised bed, somewhere water is physically forced to run away instead of pooling. And if you're the type of gardener who instinctively mulches everything, break that habit here. Skip the usual bark chips or compost mulch that hold moisture right against the stem, and use gravel or crushed stone instead. It still suppresses weeds just as well, but instead of trapping dampness against the base of the plant, it actually reflects heat and light back up into the foliage, which lavender genuinely thrives on. Get the drainage right at planting, and you've already eliminated the #1 cause of death before the plant has even had a chance to fail. Secret number 2. Drought tolerance is a trap if you apply it too early. Here is the single most damaging piece of lavender advice floating around online and at garden centers. The blanket statement that lavender is drought tolerant, repeated constantly without ever mentioning the critical detail that this is only true after the plant is established, usually after its first full year in the ground. A brand new lavender plant has a small, shallow, immature root system that simply cannot yet reach down into deeper soil moisture the way a mature plant can. So if you take that advice literally on day 1 and immediately start treating a fresh transplant like a tough, ignore-it succulent, you will kill it in its very first summer, often without ever understanding why, because everything you read told you this plant doesn't need water. During that first growing season, the actual rule is to water deeply whenever the top inch of soil feels dry to the touch, which in real summer heat usually works out to somewhere between once and twice a week. There's also a simple way to check when it's safe to pull back. Gently tug on a stem near the base. If it resists firmly instead of feeling loose in the soil, that means the roots have properly anchored themselves and the plant has crossed over into that truly drought-tolerant phase. After that point, mature lavender genuinely does not want or need scheduled watering at all. And from then on, overwatering becomes a far bigger threat to the plant than any dry spell you'll realistically encounter. Secret number 3, your soil is probably too acidic, and lavender quietly hates that. Almost every single guide out there talks endlessly about sun exposure and watering schedules, and almost none of them ever mention soil pH, even though this is one of the most common, completely undiagnosed reasons lavender just sits there underperforming for years without ever fully dying. It doesn't necessarily kill the plant outright, it just keeps it small, sparse, and unenthusiastic no matter what else you do right. Lavender wants neutral to slightly alkaline soil, somewhere in the range of 6.5 to 7.5, which is actually the opposite of what a lot of garden soil naturally sits at, especially in regions with more acidic ground, which covers a surprising number of backyards. If your lavender has decent drainage, gets full sun, and still just looks stunted and unhappy year after year, the pH is worth checking before you blame anything else. A basic soil test kit is inexpensive and takes minutes. If the reading comes back low, working a bit of garden lime into the soil around the base, then retesting after roughly 8 weeks can be the single quiet fix that finally makes a struggling plant take off, sometimes dramatically, within the same season. Secret number 4. Prune it like a wine glass, never like a hedge. This is the secret that actually determines whether your lavender survives for a full decade or dies out unevenly from the inside within 3 years. And it's the one almost every home gardener gets completely backwards. Left alone with no pruning at all, lavender only produces new, healthy foliage at the outer tips of its stems each year, while the inner stems slowly turn into bare, woody growth that can never regenerate leaves or flowers again. Once that woody core takes over the center of the plant, it starts dying back unevenly, often while the outside canopy still looks perfectly green and healthy, which is exactly why so many people are caught off guard when the whole thing suddenly collapses. The instinctive fix most people reach for is shearing it flat and round, the same way you'd trim a boxwood hedge, but that actually makes the underlying problem worse because it creates a dense outer shell of foliage that blocks any sunlight from ever reaching the interior stems. Instead, picture the shape you're aiming for as a wine glass, open and airy down at the base, gradually tapering upward. Using sharp bypass pruners, cut individual stems at an angle, thinning out roughly a quarter of the growth concentrated in the center, while leaving the outward-facing buds around the perimeter untouched. This lets real sunlight reach all the way down to the lower branches and redirects the plant's energy into deep root development instead of just producing more surface flowers. Do this once a year, ideally right after the main bloom finishes, and specifically avoid pruning in fall or late summer, because any new growth stimulated that late in the season won't have time to properly harden before the first frost arrives, which dramatically increases the risk of winter dieback. And secret number 5. Winter is where forgotten lavender actually survives or quietly dies, and it comes down to 2 things that sound contradictory until you understand how they actually work together: cold protection and cold exposure. Lavender genuinely needs a real period of winter chill to go properly dormant and reset for spring, which means bringing a potted plant indoors into a warm garage or basement for the winter, away from light and cold, doesn't actually help it. It weakens it, and you'll usually see the consequences as pale, stressed, underwhelming growth the following spring. At the same time, more tender varieties do need genuine physical protection once temperatures start consistently dropping below the 40 to 50 degree range. And the right tool for that is something breathable like a floating row cover or a simple cloche, which still lets in light and moisture instead of sealing the plant away in total darkness. If you're gardening somewhere with real, harsh winters, the actual long-term secret isn't fighting to keep a delicate French or Spanish lavender alive through conditions it was never built for. It's choosing a genuinely hardy variety, like English lavender from the very beginning, matched to your actual climate, so the plant isn't fighting for survival every single winter of its life. So here's the pattern running through all 5 of these secrets, and it's worth sitting with for a second. Lavender almost never dies from being ignored. It dies from being cared for the wrong way, overwatered instead of properly drained, treated as drought-tolerant before it's actually ready for that, planted in soil with the wrong pH and never checked, sheared into a head shape instead of thinned like a wine glass, and coddled indoors during winter instead of allowed to go properly dormant outside. Fix those 5 specific things once, right at the start, and this plant will genuinely outlive almost everything else growing in your yard, thriving for a full decade or more, while asking for barely any attention from you at all. If this just saved a lavender plant you were about to lose, subscribe, because next time we're covering the exact hardy varieties that survive the harshest winters completely on their own, without any protection whatsoever.